The story of ancient Egypt begins not with pyramids or golden pharaohs, but with a river, the Nile. Stretching more than 6,600 kilometers, the Nile was the lifeline of the desert, a thread of green in a world of endless sand. Each year, its floods came with remarkable precision, turning the dry earth into fertile farmland, and it was here, along its banks, that one of the greatest civilizations in history first took root. Yet in the beginning, Egypt was not one kingdom but two. Upper Egypt, the narrow strip of land along the southern Nile, and Lower Egypt, the wide, fertile delta where the river fanned into the Mediterranean. For centuries, these lands were divided, each ruled by its own leaders, each with its own customs and gods. But a storm was gathering, and destiny was about to unite them. Around 3100 BCE, a warrior king known to history as Narmer, sometimes called Menes, rose from Upper Egypt. He was no ordinary chieftain. Narmer was a strategist, a visionary, and above all, a conqueror determined to unite the two lands under one crown. The story of his triumph is immortalized on one of history's most important artifacts, the Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone slab carved over 5,000 years ago. On it, Narmer is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbols of unity. With this act, he created the world's first great territorial state, a kingdom that stretched from the delta to the cataracts of the Nile. The unification of Egypt was more than a political victory, it was a cultural revolution. Narmer and his successors established the first royal dynasty, laying the foundations of what we now call Pharaonic Egypt. The pharaoh was no mere king. He was seen as a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity of kingship. This belief gave the ruler absolute power, not only as a political leader, but also as the intermediary between the gods and his people. For the Egyptians, the pharaoh was the axis around which the universe turned. With unity came innovation. The early dynasties organized the first centralized administration in human history. Taxes were collected in grain and livestock, scribes developed complex systems of accounting, and monumental building projects began to reshape the Nile Valley. One of the most revolutionary achievements was the refinement of hieroglyphic writing. Though symbols had been used earlier, it was in this period that writing became a tool of state power, used to record laws, rituals, trade, and the names of kings that would echo across millennia. Alongside writing came artistic conventions that defined Egyptian culture, rigid postures, profile heads with frontal eyes, and a strict sense of order that symbolized eternal stability. Religion, too, began to take its distinctive Egyptian form. Gods and goddesses tied to natural forces were woven into a cosmic system centered on Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and order. To maintain Ma'at was the pharaoh's sacred duty, and it justified his absolute rule. Temples were built not only as houses for the gods but also as centers of economy and power, employing priests, artisans, and laborers. The intertwining of religion and politics created a society where every aspect of life, from planting crops to burying the dead, was infused with divine meaning. Death, in particular, became a central focus of Egyptian thought. The earliest pharaohs were buried in mastabas, rectangular tombs made of mud brick, precursors to the pyramids. Within these tombs were placed grave goods, pottery, tools, food, and treasures meant to sustain the ruler in the afterlife. Over time, this practice evolved into the great mortuary cults that would define Egypt's spiritual landscape. The idea that the soul, or Ka, lived on after death became a cornerstone of Egyptian belief, giving rise to the elaborate funerary traditions we still marvel at today. Economically, the early dynasties transformed Egypt into a thriving state. The Nile was a natural highway, carrying goods north and south. Trade extended beyond Egypt's borders, reaching into Nubia for gold and ivory, into the Levant for cedar wood, and across the Sinai for turquoise and copper. With this network of exchange, Egypt became not only self-sufficient but also wealthy, able to support artisans, scribes, and a class of administrators who served the pharaoh. Yet this unity was fragile. The early rulers were constantly tested by rebellions, famines, and the sheer challenge of governing such a vast territory. To maintain control, they established new capitals, built fortresses, and relied on a growing bureaucracy. It was during this time that the concept of divine kingship became more deeply entrenched. The pharaoh was not just a political ruler but the embodiment of Egypt itself. If he faltered, the land risked collapse. Still, the first dynasty succeeded in securing Egypt's future. By the end of the early dynastic period, c. 3100–2686 BCE, the foundation had been laid for the civilization that would endure for 3 millennia. Egypt had become more than just a collection of villages along the Nile. It was a united kingdom, bound by shared religion, culture, and loyalty to a divine ruler. Its people believed they had tapped into the eternal rhythm of the cosmos, and their monuments, writings, and beliefs were designed to last for eternity. The story of ancient Egypt's birth is thus not merely one of conquest but of transformation. In the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, humanity witnessed the dawn of a civilization that would outlast empires, kings, and even time itself. What Narmer began, a vision of order, divine rule, and eternal life, would echo across centuries, shaping the identity of Egypt and inspiring the world. This was only the beginning. Ahead lay the Old Kingdom, an age that would see Egypt reach new heights, when kings would command armies of workers to raise stone mountains on the desert's edge of pyramids that would defy the sands of time. The dawn of the Old Kingdom marked one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history, the building of the pyramids. This was the time when Egypt, under its early dynasties, transformed from a newly unified kingdom into a civilization of unparalleled grandeur. The Old Kingdom, spanning nearly 5 centuries, is often called the Age of the Pyramids. And for good reason. It was during this period that Egypt's most enduring monuments, symbols of power and eternity, rose on the horizon of the desert. It began with the Third Dynasty, when a brilliant king named Djoser came to the throne around 2670 BCE. Djoser's reign was one of innovation, but his greatest legacy was his tomb. Up until this point, pharaohs had been buried in mastabas, flat rectangular structures made of mud brick. Djoser envisioned something greater, something that would forever set him apart from mere mortals. He called upon his chief architect, a genius named Imhotep, who would later be worshipped as a god of wisdom and healing. Imhotep designed something the world had never seen, a pyramid built not of mud brick but of stone. Layer upon layer, the mastaba was enlarged and stacked, creating the step pyramid at Saqqara, the world's first monumental stone building. Rising nearly 200 feet above the desert, it was a staircase to the heavens, a symbol of the pharaoh's divine power and his eternal connection to the gods. The step pyramid was only the beginning. In the centuries that followed, Egypt's kings competed to outdo one another, building ever grander tombs in the desert west of the Nile. Nowhere did this ambition reach greater heights than at Giza, where pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure of the Fourth Dynasty constructed the most famous pyramids of all. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, completed around 2560 BCE, was a staggering achievement. Made of over 2.3 million limestone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons, it rose to a height of 146 meters, 481 feet, making it the tallest man-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. It was more than just a tomb. It was a cosmic statement. Its base aligned with the cardinal points, and its passages reflected the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. It was, in every sense, a gateway to eternity. But the pyramids were not built by slaves, as later myths suggested. They were constructed by tens of thousands of skilled laborers, craftsmen, and farmers, who worked in rotation during the Nile's flood season when fields lay underwater. These workers lived in vast temporary cities near the construction sites, supported by a sophisticated system of supply chains. Bread, beer, meat, and vegetables were delivered daily to sustain them, evidence of a well-organized state that could command resources on a massive scale. This organization was possible because of Egypt's centralized government, with the pharaoh at its head and a growing bureaucracy of viziers, scribes, and overseers managing every detail. The pyramids themselves were only part of the grand funerary complexes. Each pyramid was surrounded by temples, causeways, and subsidiary tombs for queens and nobles. At Giza, the great Sphinx, with the body of a lion and the face of a pharaoh, possibly Khafre, stood as a guardian of eternity, watching over the necropolis. These monumental projects reflected the Egyptians' obsession with the afterlife. To them, death was not an end but a transformation, a passage into another realm where the soul would live forever if proper rituals were observed. The pyramid was both tomb and machine, designed to ensure the king's successful journey to immortality. Religion during the Old Kingdom became more complex, centered increasingly around the sun god Ra. Pharaohs were seen not only as sons of Horus but also as the chosen of Ra, linking heaven and earth. The construction of pyramids, rising like rays of the sun, symbolized this divine connection. Priests of Ra gained power, establishing solar temples and rituals that shaped Egyptian belief for centuries. At the same time, the principle of Ma'at, order, justice, and cosmic balance guided society. The pharaoh's duty was to uphold Ma'at, ensuring harmony between gods, nature, and humanity. It was this sacred responsibility that legitimized his absolute authority. Economically, the Old Kingdom thrived. The Nile's predictable floods provided abundant harvests, allowing surpluses to support large populations and specialized labor. Trade expanded, bringing cedar wood from Lebanon, gold and ivory from Nubia, and turquoise from the Sinai. Egyptian artisans perfected their crafts, producing exquisite jewelry, statues, and reliefs that adorned temples and tombs. Art from this era reflects the ideals of permanence and order. Figures are shown in idealized forms, symbols of eternal truth rather than fleeting reality. Yet beneath the splendor of the pyramids, cracks eventually began to appear. The very system that enabled such monumental building placed enormous strain on the state. The pharaohs required vast resources to fund their projects, and over time, the regional governors, known as nomarchs, gained increasing power. As they grew wealthy and influential, the authority of the central government weakened. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, the once unshakable order of the Old Kingdom was unraveling. Famines caused by low Nile floods added to the crisis, and without strong central leadership, Egypt descended into chaos. The collapse of the Old Kingdom around 2181 BCE marked the beginning of the First Intermediate Period, a time of division and hardship. Yet the legacy of the Old Kingdom endured. The pyramids, rising from the desert sands, stood as eternal testaments to the power and vision of Egypt's early kings. They were symbols not only of royal ambition, but also of humanity's capacity to dream of eternity and build monuments to the divine. Even in ruin, they whispered of a time when Egypt stood at the pinnacle of the ancient world. Thus, the Old Kingdom was more than an age of stone and kings. It was the embodiment of Egypt's eternal spirit. It showed the world that human hands, guided by faith and order, could shape mountains and touch the heavens. Though the age would end in darkness, its monuments would shine across millennia, inspiring awe in all who gazed upon them. When the Old Kingdom collapsed, Egypt fell into a time of turmoil. The Grand Pyramids no longer rose on the horizon, and the pharaoh's once absolute authority crumbled. This was the First Intermediate Period, 2181–2055 BCE, an age of division, famine, and local rivalries. Nomarchs, the regional governors, carved out their own spheres of power, and Egypt fractured into competing states. For a time, it seemed as if the unity forged by Narmer and the glory of the pyramid builders would vanish forever. Yet, out of this darkness, a new vision of kingship arose, and with it came the rebirth of Egypt, the Middle Kingdom. The savior of Egypt was a powerful ruler from Thebes in Upper Egypt, Mentuhotep II. Around 2055 BCE, he launched a campaign to reunite the two lands. After years of war against rival dynasties, he emerged victorious and founded the 11th dynasty, restoring order and re-establishing Egypt as a single kingdom. His reign marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a period that would last nearly 4 centuries and become known as a golden age of stability, culture, and prosperity. Mentuhotep II was more than a conqueror, he was a unifier. He rebuilt the machinery of government, curbing the power of the nomarchs and centralizing authority once again under the crown. Yet unlike the distant god-kings of the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom pharaohs projected themselves as shepherds of their people. They emphasized justice, fairness, and care for their subjects, ideals rooted in the principle of man. This new vision of kingship was reflected in literature and art, which began to portray pharaohs as compassionate rulers rather than untouchable divinities. One of the most distinctive features of the Middle Kingdom was the flourishing of literature. For the first time, Egyptian writings went beyond religious texts and royal inscriptions. Stories, wisdom literature, and philosophical works spread throughout the kingdom. Tales like the story of Sinu, about an official who flees Egypt and longs to return, reveal a society deeply concerned with themes of loyalty, justice, and belonging. Instructions and proverbs, such as those of Ptahotep, guided Egyptians on how to live a moral life. These texts reflect a people who were introspective, grappling with questions of mortality, duty, and destiny in ways that still resonate today. Art and architecture also evolved. While monumental pyramids gave way to smaller, less extravagant tombs, temples became more prominent as centers of worship and power. Pharaohs built temples dedicated to the gods across Egypt, reinforcing their role as guardians of religion and order. Mortuary temples, such as Mentuhotep's magnificent complex at Deir el-Bahri, blended architecture and natural landscape, foreshadowing later achievements of the new kingdom. Statues from this period depict pharaohs with more realism, their faces lined with care and responsibility, a striking contrast to the idealized, eternal youth of Old Kingdom rulers. This artistic shift symbolized the new conception of leadership. Kings as mortal men chosen to serve their people and the gods. Religion itself underwent subtle but important changes. The god Amun, once a local deity of Thebes, rose to national prominence, eventually merging with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, the supreme deity of Egypt. This shift reflected the growing influence of Thebes as the heart of political and religious life. At the same time, ordinary Egyptians found increasing hope in the possibility of an afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, eternal life had been the privilege of kings. But during the Middle Kingdom, funerary texts like the coffin texts expanded the promise of immortality to common people, provided they lived in accordance with man and received proper burial rites. This democratization of the afterlife gave new meaning to daily existence and reinforced the importance of moral conduct. Economically, the Middle Kingdom thrived on agriculture, trade, and expansion. Pharaohs restored irrigation systems, reclaimed land for farming, and organized large-scale projects to ensure food security. Expeditions ventured into Nubia to extract gold, ivory, and exotic goods, while trade routes extended into the Levant and the Sinai Peninsula. The construction of forts in Nubia secured Egypt's southern border and allowed control over the rich mines of the region. These resources fueled Egypt's wealth, allowing for cultural and artistic achievements to flourish once again. The Middle Kingdom also saw advances in engineering and military organization. Pharaohs commissioned massive building projects, canals, and fortifications, demonstrating Egypt's renewed strength. The fortresses in Nubia, such as those at Semna, were not only military outposts but also symbols of Egyptian dominance and power. The army itself became more professional, employing archers, chariots, and new tactics influenced by contact with neighboring peoples. Yet despite its prosperity, the Middle Kingdom was not without challenges. The balance of power remained delicate, with ambitious nomarchs occasionally threatening central authority. Moreover, Egypt's increasing reliance on Nubian gold and foreign trade made it vulnerable to external pressures. By the late 13th dynasty, internal instability returned, and Egypt entered the Second Intermediate Period, a time when foreign invaders, the Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant, would establish control over parts of the Nile Delta. Still, the legacy of the Middle Kingdom was profound. It was an age of intellectual and cultural blossoming, where Egyptian identity deepened and the idea of the pharaoh as a just ruler of all people, not just a distant god, took hold. Its literature and art reveal a society deeply reflective, wrestling with timeless human concerns, justice, loyalty, and the search for meaning. The Middle Kingdom laid the spiritual and cultural foundations that would carry Egypt into its most dazzling age of empire, the New Kingdom. For nearly 400 years, Egypt had been restored, united under pharaohs who balanced power with compassion, and who expanded the promise of eternity to rich and poor alike. When later Egyptians looked back on their history, they remembered the Middle Kingdom as a time when Egypt's heart beat strong, when kings were shepherds, and when the voice of wisdom echoed across the land. The Middle Kingdom had been a time of renewal, but by the 17th century BCE, Egypt once again faced turmoil. The Hyksos, foreign rulers of Semitic origin, had infiltrated the Nile Delta during the Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650–1550 BCE. They introduced powerful new technologies, horses, chariots, and advanced weaponry that Egypt had never seen before. For nearly a century, these outsiders ruled parts of Lower Egypt, while native Egyptian kings clung to power in Thebes. This was a dark chapter, but from it emerged a determination that would propel Egypt into its most glorious age, the New Kingdom. The Hyksos were eventually expelled by a line of Theban warriors, beginning with Seqenenre-Tao, who died fighting them, and culminating with Ahmose I, founder of the 18th dynasty. By 1550 BCE, Egypt was united once more, and Ahmose not only restored Egyptian sovereignty, but also embraced the very technologies of the Hyksos, ensuring that Egypt would never again be caught unprepared. With new weapons and military strategies, Egypt transformed itself into a true empire, one that would expand its borders farther than ever before. The New Kingdom marked Egypt's golden age, a time of dazzling wealth, military might, and cultural achievements. Pharaohs became warrior kings, leading armies deep into Asia and Nubia. Under rulers like Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt, Egypt conquered territories stretching from the Euphrates in modern Syria to the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in Nubia. Egypt became the most powerful state in the ancient Near East, dominating trade routes and amassing tribute from vassal kingdoms. This expansion brought immense riches, gold, slaves, exotic animals, and luxury goods, which flowed into the temples and palaces of Thebes. Yet military power was only one aspect of the New Kingdom's grandeur. The pharaohs built monuments on a scale never before imagined. At Karnak, massive temples dedicated to Amun-Ra rose in splendor, their towering pylons and forest-like hypostyle halls designed to inspire awe. Processions, rituals, and festivals reinforced the divine power of the pharaoh and the gods, with Amun-Ra at the center of a growing religious cult. The wealth of empire funded colossal statues, obelisks, and sprawling temple complexes, many of which still stand as the most iconic symbols of ancient Egypt. Among the most remarkable rulers of the 18th dynasty was Hatshepsut, one of the few women to take the title of pharaoh. Ruling in the 15th century BCE, she reigned not as regent but as sovereign in her own right. Hatshepsut promoted trade over war, sending expeditions to the land of Punt, likely modern-day Somalia, which returned with incense, myrrh, ivory, and exotic animals. She built extensively, leaving behind one of Egypt's most breathtaking monuments. her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a terraced masterpiece harmoniously blending architecture with the cliffs of western Thebes. Though later pharaohs tried to erase her name, her legacy endures as proof of Egypt's capacity for innovation and inclusion. The New Kingdom was also the stage for one of history's most extraordinary and controversial revolutions, the Amarna period. Pharaoh Akhenaten, originally Amenhotep IV, broke with centuries of tradition by abandoning the worship of Amen and elevating the Aten, the sun disk, as the sole god. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and imposed a radical form of monotheism. This religious upheaval shook Egyptian society, undermining the powerful priesthood of Amen. Art during this period also shifted dramatically, portraying the royal family in unprecedented intimacy and realism. But Akhenaten's revolution was short-lived. After his death, the old order was restored by his successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, whose lavish tomb, discovered nearly intact in 1922, became the most famous archaeological find in history. Though Tutankhamun's reign was brief and relatively insignificant, his burial treasures have immortalized him as a global icon. The 19th dynasty continued Egypt's imperial power with rulers like Seti I and his son Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great. Ramesses reigned for over 60 years, leading military campaigns, constructing colossal monuments, and leaving behind a legacy of grandeur that few rulers in history could rival. His most famous battle was at Kadesh against the Hittites, one of the great superpowers of the time. Though the battle ended in a stalemate, Ramesses proclaimed it as a great victory, immortalizing it in inscriptions across Egypt. Eventually, he signed one of the world's earliest known peace treaties with the Hittites, a testament to diplomacy as well as war. Ramesses built prolifically, most notably at Abu Simbel, where giant seated statues of the king gaze out across the desert, symbols of Egypt's enduring might. Life during the New Kingdom reflected the prosperity of empire. Nobles built lavish tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, filled with richly decorated walls depicting the journey to the afterlife. Art achieved new heights of sophistication, while literature, hymns, and tales flourished. Ordinary Egyptians, too, benefited from Egypt's wealth. Farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers formed part of a society where, despite its rigid hierarchy, opportunity existed for those who served the state loyally. Women in particular held a respected role, able to own property, conduct business, and in rare cases like Hatshepsut, even rule as pharaoh. But no golden age lasts forever. By the late 20th dynasty, Egypt began to decline. Successive pharaohs faced invasions from the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Economic strain, corruption, and weakening central authority eroded the strength of the state. The power of the priests of Amen grew, rivaling that of the pharaoh himself, and the unity of Egypt once again began to fracture. By 1070 BCE, the New Kingdom came to an end, giving way to the Third Intermediate Period, an era of division and foreign influence. Yet the New Kingdom remained Egypt's most brilliant chapter. It was the age of warrior kings and female pharaohs, of vast temples and grand tombs, of empire and diplomacy. It was a time when Egypt stood at the pinnacle of world power, shaping the destiny of nations and leaving monuments so enduring that they still inspire awe today. When we think of ancient Egypt, the towering statues, the golden treasures, the mystique of the Valley of the Kings, we are seeing the legacy of the New Kingdom. It was a golden age in every sense, the flowering of a civilization that believed it could touch eternity. The brilliance of the New Kingdom had illuminated the world, but by the dawn of the late period, Egypt's golden light was dimming. Once the strongest power of the Near East, Egypt was now a shadow of its former self, struggling to hold on to independence while new empires rose around it. The years between 664 and 332 BCE were marked by resilience and revival, but also by conquest. foreign domination, and a final act of fading glory before the arrival of Alexander the Great. The new kingdom's collapse had left Egypt divided. During the Third Intermediate Period, 1070–664 BCE, power was fragmented between pharaohs in the north and the high priests of Amun in Thebes. Nubian kings from the south seized the throne at one point, while Libyan chieftains carved out dynasties of their own. Egypt was no longer the united colossus it had once been, but a land vulnerable to foreign intervention. Into this chaos came the Assyrians, the most ruthless empire of the age. With iron weapons and brutal tactics, they stormed into Egypt in the 7th century BCE, reducing it to a vassal state. Yet even this humiliation could not erase Egypt's spirit. The turning point came with the rise of the 26th dynasty, founded by Ptolemaic I around 664 BCE. He capitalized on Assyria's waning power and reasserted Egyptian independence. For a brief moment, Egypt seemed reborn. Ptolemaic and his successors, ruling from the new capital at Sais, ushered in what historians call the Sate Renaissance. They looked back to the glory of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, reviving traditional art, religion, and culture in a conscious effort to reconnect with Egypt's ancient identity. Temples were restored, hieroglyphs were revived with new precision, and a sense of national pride spread across the Nile Valley. Economically and militarily, the Sate kings also strengthened Egypt. They encouraged trade with Greece, Phoenicia, and the wider Mediterranean world, opening Egypt to foreign influence like never before. Greek mercenaries were hired to bolster Egypt's armies, and Greek traders established colonies, especially in the city of Naucratis, which became a vibrant hub of cultural exchange. It was a paradox. In order to protect Egypt from foreigners, the Sate pharaohs increasingly relied on them. Still, for a century and a half, Egypt experienced stability and revival under its native rulers. But the world was changing. In the east, a new empire was rising, the Persians. Under Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire turned its gaze on Egypt. In 525 BCE, at the Battle of Pelusium, Cambyses defeated Ptolemaic III, the last pharaoh of the Sate dynasty. Egypt was incorporated into the vast Persian Empire as a satrapy province. For the first time, Egypt was not merely invaded but ruled as part of a global empire. The Persians respected Egypt's traditions, allowing temples to function and priests to continue their rituals, but the loss of independence was a bitter blow. Egypt, once the cradle of civilization, was now a conquered land. Yet Egypt's story was not over. Periodically, native dynasties rose up and threw off Persian rule, restoring pharaonic independence for a few decades at a time. The most notable of these was the 30th dynasty, led by Nectanebo I and II, 380–343 BCE. They built temples, fortified Egypt's borders, and sought to restore the kingdom's ancient prestige. But the Persians, under Artaxerxes III, returned in force, crushing Egypt's resistance in 343 BCE. Nectanebo II fled south, and with his departure ended the line of native Egyptian pharaohs. Egypt would never again be ruled by its own sons. The final act of the late period was written by a new conqueror, Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, the Macedonian king swept into Egypt as part of his campaign against the Persian Empire. Unlike the Persians or Assyrians before him, Alexander styled himself as Egypt's liberator. At Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, and at the Oracle of Siwa Oasis, he was declared the son of Amun, aligning himself with Egypt's deepest traditions. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest cultural centers of the ancient world. Though Alexander left Egypt under the control of his general Ptolemy, his conquest marked the end of the Pharaonic age and the beginning of a new era, the Hellenistic period. The late period, then, was a time of twilight. Egypt no longer dominated the known world, but it endured as a symbol of resilience. Even as foreign powers ruled, Egyptian culture maintained its essence. Temples were still built in the style of the ancients, priests still recited hymns to Amun and Ra, and the people still trusted in Mad, the eternal balance of the universe. In many ways, Egypt's cultural survival during these centuries of decline was as remarkable as its earlier triumphs. Though its political power waned, its spiritual and cultural influence continued to shape the Mediterranean world. In the end, the late period was not simply an age of decline, but one of transition. It bridged the gap between the grandeur of the pharaohs and the cosmopolitan world of Alexander and the Ptolemies. It was Egypt's last attempt to reclaim its independence, its final struggle to remain the master of its own destiny. And while it ultimately failed, it left behind a legacy of endurance. For even under foreign rule, Egypt remained Egypt, the eternal land of the Nile, keeper of secrets and guardian of a civilization that had once ruled the stars. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, he ended centuries of Persian domination and ushered in a new era. The Egyptians welcomed him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. In Memphis, Alexander was crowned pharaoh, and at the Siwa Oasis, the oracle declared him to be the son of Amun. For the Egyptians, this aligned him with their sacred traditions. But Alexander did not stay long. His ambitions pulled him eastward, and Egypt became just one jewel in his growing empire. After Alexander's untimely death in 323 BCE, his generals divided his vast conquests. Egypt fell to Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's trusted commanders. Thus began the Ptolemaic Dynasty, 332–30 BCE, a line of Greek rulers who would reign as pharaohs for nearly 3 centuries. Though foreign in origin, the Ptolemies adopted Egyptian traditions, blending Greek and Egyptian culture in ways that made Egypt a beacon of the Hellenistic world. The jewel of this new era was Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded on the Mediterranean coast. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria grew into one of the greatest cities of antiquity, a hub of commerce, scholarship, and culture. Its most famous institution was the Library of Alexandria, said to have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the known world. Alongside it stood the Lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships into the bustling harbor. Alexandria became a city where Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian wisdom, where science, mathematics, medicine, and art flourished. Yet the Ptolemaic rulers were not only patrons of learning, they were also pragmatic politicians. They styled themselves as both Greek kings and Egyptian pharaohs, appearing in Greek dress when dealing with their Hellenistic subjects, and donning traditional Egyptian regalia when presenting themselves to the people of the Nile. Temples were built and restored in the ancient style, reinforcing the dynasty's legitimacy in Egyptian eyes. The cult of Serapis, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian religious traditions, symbolized this blending of cultures. But beneath the grandeur lay tension. The Ptolemies ruled a land divided between Greek elites and native Egyptians, who often resented foreign domination. Peasant revolts and uprisings erupted periodically, and maintaining power required both diplomacy and military strength. The dynasty relied heavily on alliances with Rome, the rising power of the Mediterranean. Over time, Egypt became less independent, more entangled in Roman politics. The last and most famous ruler of this dynasty was Cleopatra VII. Intelligent, multilingual, and politically astute, Cleopatra sought to restore Egypt's independence by allying with the mightiest men of Rome. First, she formed a partnership with Julius Caesar, securing her throne in a bloody civil war against her brother. Later, she allied herself with Mark Antony, both politically and romantically, in a bid to resist Rome's dominance. But their ambition clashed with Rome's rising power. In 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. The following year, Alexandria fell, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives, and Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the Ptolemaic Dynasty ended, and with it, over 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. The Ptolemaic era was a paradox, a time of great cultural flowering, yet also of decline. Under the Greek pharaohs, Egypt remained wealthy and influential, but no longer the master of its own destiny. Its legacy, however, endured through the city of Alexandria, a beacon of knowledge whose influence stretched far beyond Egypt's borders. The story of ancient Egypt spans more than 3 millennia, from the unification of the two lands under Narmer to the death of Cleopatra. It is a tale of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy, of a civilization that shaped the course of human history like few others. But what is Egypt's true legacy? First, Egypt left behind its monuments, the pyramids, temples, and tombs that still stand as some of humanity's greatest achievements. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built more than 4,500 years ago, remains one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and continues to inspire awe. The temples of Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel reveal the artistry and devotion of a people who saw their gods reflected in every stone. These monuments were not merely structures. They were bridges between the mortal and divine, designed to endure for eternity. Second, Egypt shaped the world through its knowledge. Egyptian priests and scribes developed one of the earliest writing systems, hieroglyphics, preserving religious texts, historical records, and literary masterpieces. Their advances in mathematics, engineering, and medicine laid the groundwork for later civilizations. Egyptian doctors practiced surgery and understood anatomy in ways far ahead of their time. Their calendar, based on the cycles of the Nile and the stars, influenced later timekeeping systems. Third, Egypt gave the world a vision of the afterlife. The belief in immortality, preserved through mummification and funerary texts, reflected a spiritual worldview that influenced not only later Mediterranean religions, but also humanity's enduring fascination with life beyond death. Concepts of moral judgment, divine justice, and eternal reward that appeared in Egyptian religion would echo in later faiths, including Greek philosophy, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Egypt also left behind its cultural memory. Even after the pharaohs were gone, Egypt continued to inspire conquerors and dreamers. The Greeks and Romans marveled at its antiquity, medieval travelers spoke of its wonders, and in the modern age, the rediscovery of Tutankhamun's tomb reignited the world's obsession with Egypt's mysteries. Today, millions flock to the Nile Valley to stand before the same monuments that once awed Herodotus, Alexander, and Napoleon. But perhaps Egypt's greatest legacy is its endurance. Few civilizations have lasted so long, adapting through conquest, change, and challenge, yet maintaining a distinct identity. From the Old Kingdom's pyramids to the Ptolemaic temples, Egypt reinvented itself time and again while holding fast to its core values of ma'at, order, balance, and truth. When Cleopatra died and Egypt became a Roman province, its political independence was gone, but its soul lived on. In Alexandria, scholars preserved knowledge that would shape the course of Western civilization. In the desert sands, temples and tombs continued to whisper the story of gods and kings. And in the collective imagination of humanity, ancient Egypt became eternal, a land of mystery, wonder, and timeless inspiration. Even now, thousands of years later, the image of the pharaoh, the hieroglyph, the pyramid, and the Nile remain symbols of humanity's eternal quest for greatness. Egypt was not merely a civilization. It was, and remains, a reminder that we too can build legacies that outlast time itself.